Good afternoon. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual event titled How the Built Environment Affects Public Trust in Canadian Municipalities. My name is Thomas Hatchard, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Research here at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto. Although this event is virtual, and I realize that everyone is at a different location, I do wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'd like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the Neptus Foundation, the City of Toronto, the Region of Halton, and the Region of York. And I'd like to thank our team at IMFG and at the Monk School, Piali, Stacy, and Daria, for everything they've done to make this event possible. If you're tweeting about this event, our hashtag is hashtag IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is at IMFG Toronto. We're going to be taking audience questions at the end of the session, and so you can ask those at any time using the Zoom's Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So one of our goals at IMFG is to support graduate students who work on topics in municipal finance and governance through two fellowships. We heard from one of our IMFG fellows a few weeks ago, and today we're going to hear from Fernando Calderón Figueroa, who is this year's IMFG Blanche and Sandy Van Ginkel Graduate Fellow. That fellowship is funded through a generous donation that was made by Diamante Development. Fernando is a PhD candidate at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, and before joining U of T, he worked developing policy-oriented data on political engagement, local communities, and Indigenous peoples for the Peruvian government. His presentation today is focused on the relationship between the built infrastructure of cities and trust and social solidarity. And as you'll hear, his research is really a data-driven approach to exploring some of the core preconceptions about density in cities. His presentation today is part of his ongoing research for his dissertation. And so apart from any questions that you may have, we also welcome comments or suggestions, and you can share those through the Q&A function as well. We may not get to them, but we'll make sure that Fernando receives them afterwards, after the event. So logistically, Fernando's going to present for just over half an hour, and following the presentation, he and I are going to have a short discussion, and then we're going to turn over to you, the audience, for some more questions. So please do not forget to ask those. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Fernando.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Second. There we go. So hello, everybody. My name is Fernando Calderón Figueroa, and as Thomas said, I'm this year's Blanche and Sandy Van Ginkel Graduate Fellow at the Institute for Municipal Finance and Governance. First, I want to thank the Institute's team, particularly Enid, Thomas, and Piali for their support to my research. I'm really glad to have gotten to know you throughout the past year. I'd like to start this presentation with how I became interested in urban density and social trust. Cities are fascinating places. They have radically transformed the standards of living around the world since the Industrial Revolution. As the rapid urbanization process swept the world in the late 19th century, sociologists like Fernando opened a debate about whether cities were destroying the basis of community or whether new forms of community were possible in complex societies. More concretely, the question was, were the new dense urban neighborhoods capable of creating social ties among the residents? Answers to this question have varied a lot in the past century or so. In the 1930s, the Chicago School of Sociology provided a negative view of urban density. For instance, sociologist Louis Wirth claimed that primary relationships in cities were now, quote unquote, impersonal, transitory, and segmental. This is what later became known as the community loss hypothesis. By contrary, in the 1960s, a new generation of urban scholars argued that new forms of community could grow in diverse and busy central neighborhoods. Jane Jacobs was among the most prominent figures in the defense of urban density through her activism, both in New York and Toronto. Jacobs argued that density fosters innovation, tolerance, and social cohesion. In central cities, people can rely on neighbors to keep an eye on one another as everyone has, quote unquote, eyes on the street, Jacobs claimed. The debate around urban density and its relationship with community are particularly important amid crisis. This became evident in 2020 through the emergence of the Caremongering Movement. Two of the most widespread measures in response to the COVID-19 pandemic were the lockdowns, which we're still experiencing in some cases, and the calls to keep social distance, which meant staying 2 meters apart from any other person in shared spaces. These measures added a social component to the already existing health crisis. Many individuals and families faced isolation and food insecurity. In this context, accessibility to grocery stores and basic services became crucial. For those with limited access to income or food, several food preparation and delivery grassroots initiatives took up in municipalities like Toronto, Brampton, Montreal, Halifax, just to name a few. Together, they were called the Caremongering Movement. At the core, these initiatives, like many other aspects of our social life, rely on interpersonal trust. Volunteers must trust each other to coordinate efforts, just as much as food recipients trust volunteers and vice versa. So the question that emerges is whether the degree of social trust is related to the built environment around them. In other words, can certain features of the built environment foster social trust? More concretely, I pose this question in 3 parts. First, I ask whether trust is evenly distributed across different parts of the city. In other words, are trusting and mistrusting people evenly distributed across metropolitan areas? Second, Second, if so, how is the spatial configuration of trust related to the access to urban amenities, ranging from libraries and parks to healthcare and job opportunities, and features of the urban design, specifically pedestrian-friendly intersections? The third question combines the previous elements with characteristics that research has shown are associated with higher levels of trust at the individual level, not at the context. So I asked, how do the contextual elements interact with other individual predictors of trust, namely participation in voluntary associations and the number of informal social ties? I will explain some of these terms in a bit. So in response, the project has 3 main hypotheses. First, I argue that trust is spatially concentrated in certain parts of the urban landscape. Second, I argue that accessible areas foster trust by facilitating informal social interactions. Third, that the presence of urban amenities also fosters trust by creating opportunities for individuals to participate in community-oriented activities, such as those promoted by churches, schools, community centers, and the like. So these are the 3 hypotheses. So in the social sciences, we know a lot about the positive outcomes of trust. Scholars have studied how it reduces risk aversion and allows social cooperation and collective action. We also know that trust is influenced by early life experiences, among other psychological traits. In my study, I addressed some of the most discussed social conditions of trust, adding a spatial dimension to that. Concretely, the influence of the built environment. First, we need to ask, what is trust? Trust can be defined as the expectation of good intentions from others. It has a rational component that allows us to predict others' behavior, but it's also deeply relational because it's practical rather than fully conscious, and it's constantly being updated through our interactions. For example, we trust that the bus driver will take us to our work or home safely every day. By contrast, our trusting strangers on the street can be deeply affected by bad experiences, such as getting mugged. Now, the literature on trust has identified 3 main social conditions of trust. First, research shows that in-group versus out-group distinctions matter. In other words, we tend to trust more people in our inner circles than those outside of them. However, the 2 spheres are connected, since our early experiences with different others shape our capacity to generalize trust beyond our family and friends. This is often known as the radius of trust. Second, individuals who take part in voluntary associations usually report higher levels of trust. However, the effect is mediated by how socially diverse associations are. So for instance, participating in associations with people from more diverse backgrounds usually leads to higher levels of social trust. Finally, there is a positive relationship between trust and what we call informal social ties. These ties are developed with people we rarely know, but can recognize in the streets. For instance, the grocery store clerk we visit regularly, or fellow dog walkers we meet regularly in our communities. All these share a common element. Context is important in developing trust. The group boundaries between those we trust and those we trust less are often spatially defined around the family, the block, the neighborhood, or even the city. Participating in voluntary associations is easier when they are nearby, even in the Zoom era. And informal social ties develop over time as people become more familiar with one another through recurrent encounters. So I emphasize how the configuration of the built environment affects trust through these social conditions. The data for this study comes from two sources. For the main outcomes of interest and control variables, I have used the General Social Survey microdata from the 2008 and 2013 cycles. These cycles included multiple questions about trust, social networks, and volunteering. The sample I have used aggregates respondents above 18 years of age, living in the top 5 census metropolitan areas by population, which are Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa, Gatineau, and Edmonton. For the analysis, I grouped respondents at the census tract and metropolitan levels. My second source is a proximity measures database. Statistics Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation made the data available in 2020. It provides 10 measures of proximity, most of them at walking distance, plus a composite indicator that distinguishes the dissemination blocks as amenity dense and high amenity dense. Amenities here are defined as the sources of employment, grocery stores, pharmacies, healthcare, childcare, primary and secondary education, public transit, neighborhood parks, within a certain distance. The proximity measures were calculated using a gravity model that accounts for the size of the service. This basically means that the proximity measures indicate higher values for larger amenities as they provide services to more people than smaller ones. I have also used, and I didn't include that in the slide, a measure of the number of pedestrian-friendly intersections at the census tract level. That means the average number of pedestrian-friendly intersections within a certain radius from every dissemination block in these 5 census metropolitan areas. I will show some of that in the models later. There are 4 variables of interest in this study. They are aimed to capture both generalized trust, that is trusting anybody, and the radius of trust, that is how inwardly or outwardly oriented the respondent's trust towards others is. So generalized trust is better captured by questions that ask whether the respondent trusts strangers, which is the most general and abstract category of all. However, the experiments show that trust is best captured when questions provide specific context. Thus, the second variable of interest draws on whether the respondent thinks it's likely that a stranger would return a wallet with $200 in it. This is based on the GSS data. The latter 2 dependent variables, 3 and 4 in this slide, capture the radius of trust by creating a composite indicator of the difference between trust in strangers and trust in neighbors using both the direct questions and those of the wallet vignette. So for instance, the variable trust difference, the 4th one, ranges from -4 to +4, the 3rd one, sorry, to +4, where negative values indicate more locally oriented trust and the positive values indicate more outwardly oriented trust. The independent variables are grouped by level of analysis. At the individual level, I use the respondents' number of non-close friends or acquaintances, and if they belong to at least one voluntary organization in the past year from the survey. As I mentioned earlier, informal social ties and membership to voluntary associations are often associated with trust. I include other variables for the statistical control in the models, such as population density, the length of residence in the community, and the respondent's visible minority status, educational level, age, and gender. So we can start by taking a look at the spatial distribution of the attributes of the built environment I'm trying to assess. These maps show the spatial distribution of the proximity measures composite indicator at the metropolitan level. We can note that the dissemination blocks where more density of amenities tend to be in cities, particularly central areas. We can zoom in a bit more. And here we can notice the patterns in each metropolitan area larger city. So in this case, Edmonton, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver. The darker colors indicating a higher density of amenities, according to this data source that I mentioned, the proximity measures database. We can see a similar pattern, although not exactly the same, of concentration when we examine the proximity to pedestrian intersections. As you can tell from these metropolitan maps, pedestrian intersections are mostly concentrated in central urban areas. It's not always the case. It's not exactly the same as the previous one, but it's fairly similar. Now, given the nature of the data, I have used multi-level models. The basic idea behind these models is to split the analysis in two, at the individual and at the census tract levels at least. Since this study involves 5 different metropolitan areas, I calculated models with the CMA, the census metropolitan area, as an additional level of analysis. So the results are actually considered 3 levels of analysis. But the results showed that the spatial distribution of trust is better explained by only 2 levels. So the 3rd level actually doesn't add a lot of new information. I can talk some more about the technical aspects of the models in the Q&A for those of you who may be interested. Now let's take a look at some of the findings. First, the 4 outcomes of interest are fairly spatially concentrated. So regarding our first hypothesis about trust being spatially concentrated, this is what we find. This is what I find. All of these outcomes of interest show spatial autocorrelation of about 0.1 in the Moran's I scale. This is a scale that ranges from -1 to +1. In this scale, negative values indicate that an attribute is spatially dispersed, whereas positive ones suggest that an attribute is spatially concentrated. In all 4 cases, the indexes are positive and statistically significant. Here I show a map of the reported trust in the 5 metropolitan areas at the census tract level. Darker colors indicate higher trust. As you can see, the map does not overlap exactly with the image of the built environment we saw before, which is somewhat of an interesting story to unpack in a bit. Now, taking a look at the results from the models to assess my hypothesis 2 and 3, I will present 4 plots, one for each output of interest. Each plot includes 2 models, one represented through green dots and whiskers, and another one through orange dots and whiskers. The difference between them has to do with interaction terms, but I can talk about this more in the Q&A. For practical purposes, and since both sets of models tend to be very similar, I will mostly focus on the orange ones. Now, to read this plot, you can think of each row as the estimated effect of that variable on trust. The effects are standardized, so they're all comparable. Each coefficient is represented by a dot and its confidence intervals by the whiskers on each side. If the coefficient falls over the vertical red line that indicates 0, it means the coefficient is not statistically significant. The left and right sides of the red line indicate negative and positive effects, respectively. So in this plot, we see the models for my first outcome of interest, the reported trust in strangers. The first 2 rows represent the individual level variables, the number of acquaintances and the associational membership of the respondent. We can see that only associational membership has a significant positive effect on trust. The 3rd and 4th variables are amenity density and pedestrian intersections. Of these 2, the only significant positive effect is that of amenity density. This aligns with my hypothesis that density is associated with higher levels of trust. The variables that come below are controls. As such, they are not central to the model, but they do provide interesting insights. For instance, population density does not have a significant effect on its own, which suggests that measures of the built environment are important to account for urban density. So it's not just about population. Then we can see that people of visible minority groups, those with low educational level, and those who identify as females are usually less trusting of strangers. The opposite occurs with older respondents, who in general are more trusting. Finally, at the bottom of the plot, we see some interaction terms that indicate that the individual and the contextual variables have combined effects. I can talk about the interaction terms more in the Q&A for those interested. These are the results for the wallet vignette models. Just as a reminder, this question asks whether the respondent considers it likely that a stranger on the street will return a wallet with $200. Here, the individual level predictors, number of acquaintances and associational memberships have positive and significant effects. However, the built environment or the amenity and pedestrian intersection density have no significant effects. This result is interesting as it seems to have little support for the use of built environment on levels of trust. However, the story gets a bit more interesting when we take a look at the radius of trust, not just the specific questions. Let's take a look first at the radius of reported trust, my third variable of interest. Again, higher values of this measure indicate more outwardly oriented trust. Among the individual level predictors, we find significant effect of acquaintances and associational membership, but in opposite directions. This seems to indicate that respondents who reported more acquaintances tend to have more inwardly oriented trust, but this could be further examined. Regarding our measures of the built environment, we see that both the density of amenities and pedestrian intersections have positive effects. This suggests that denser urban areas could foster more outwardly oriented trust. The remaining controls have mostly negative coefficients except for population density. A similar story can be told using the models with our other measure of interest, the radius of trust that draws on the wallet vignette question. In this case, positive values indicate more outwardly oriented trust associated with the likelihood that a stranger versus a neighbor would return a lost wallet with $200. Here we can see that the individual level predictors remain significant. Respondents with more acquaintances report more outwardly oriented trust, whereas those who belong to voluntary associations seem to show slightly more inwardly oriented trust. The built environment measures have some of the highest effects here, indicating that both the density of amenities and pedestrian intersections can foster more outwardly oriented trust. Moreover, population density also has a positive and significant effect. Now, I want to finish this presentation with some remarks regarding my project's implications for policy. The first one is that trust underpins communities. Communities where people trust each other are more resilient. Therefore, the fact that trust is unevenly distributed in cities and metropolis must call our attention. Second, I have shown that trust, especially outwardly oriented trust, is correlated with higher access to urban amenities and pedestrian-friendly intersections. This finding seems to align more with the hypothesis that density has positive effects on trust. However, there are nuances to this finding that I've presented throughout the models. In any way, the finding does suggest that more efforts can be made to promote amenity and more pedestrian-dense environments. Finally, I believe that cities and provinces and local authorities can increase their efforts to prevent urban and suburban growth that overlooks their effects on social life. Policies such as the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy have attempted to improve neighborhoods in need through, among other things, investment in their social infrastructure. I think there's room for further efforts in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. That was great. Some really meaty data there to dig into. If you want to unshare your screen, then we can have the conversation. So to the audience, please send in your questions using the Q&A format. I'm going to get us started with a couple here, but then I will be moving quickly into your questions. So please do send those along. So Fernando, I wanted to start because with a question about the different cities you talk about here. You presented data from 5 different cities. You in the maps you present, you sort of show some of the findings from all of them. But I was curious, maybe if you could just speak a little bit to any noticeable, interesting differences that you found between the cities.
Yes, I think that's a great question, Thomas. I think I appreciate it because it helps me clarify some of the things that I wanted to mention about this. There are the differences at the city level are not that high. I would have expected to find higher differences in trust across different metropolitan areas. However, the trends are fairly similar, except in some cases with Montreal, and I will show some plots about this that I've prepared at the end of the same presentation. Just give me 1 second. So the main difference has been usually around Montreal. This is a plot for just the trust levels by the reported trust measure, the question about whether people trust strangers. And as you can see, Montreal is a bit below the other metro areas that I've examined, sorry. The same happens with the wallet vignette, and the same happens with a bit with the difference between trusting that a stranger minus a neighbor would return the lost wallet. It's a very slight difference. So I think it's not, it doesn't create a lot of variability. That's why I haven't really discussed the differences as much. I believe there's some research that has tried to show some international differences across municipalities between French-speaking and English-speaking Canadian cities. But I think for the most part, the differences are not that high.
That's interesting. So the other question I had, and actually we're definitely getting a good number of audience questions here, so please do keep sending those along. But one of the audience members here asks if the presence of parks and artwork fosters stronger trust. And it does get to a question I wanted to ask, which is, you talk about the effect of amenities generally, but whether your research have examined whether some amenities are more impactful than others, as the audience member here says, maybe parks and artwork are better than libraries or vice versa.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I appreciate the question because that's been, as I've been doing this research, I think I've spent quite a bit of time trying to single out the effects of each of these types of amenities and see whether they make a huge impact. And I think for the most part, it's more about the composition of the whole thing than individual interventions. So one way I tried to think about this was running, it's a statistical technique that's similar to principal component analysis, which basically means summarizing the data from several indicators into just one. I can share that a bit too. And what I found is that this is how I can explain this later if people are interested, but basically what it means is that when you combine all of these measures of proximity to amenities, you can create just a single dimension that accounts for 50% of the variance. That means that for the most part, the effects are are related to the fact that these amenities are combined. In other words, the more combination you have of amenities, the higher number of proximity to multiple amenities creates the effect rather than single interventions. I think there's room for further research trying to isolate effects of specific types of amenities, but I think it's more about the composition of neighborhoods as a whole rather than individual interventions, as far as I've found through this data at least.
That's interesting. I mean, I wonder whether, do you have a sense or do you have a hypothesis about what it, what it is about the amenities that does this? Is it because what you just presented there about it being a sort of a matter of quantity to some extent, about having a good range of them, suggests that people might use the amenities will use the amenities they have in order to in ways that create more trust. So is it, what is it about these amenities that you think might be creating the seeds for more trust? Is it being able to, that they gather people together, and therefore, like, if it's a park or a library, doesn't matter, because as long as you just have multiple places to gather, that's what matters? Or is there something else that maybe is involved here?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I think it's this kind of research about trust lies at an intersection of further, like, a big debate in sociology and social sciences between whether two positions around, and that's almost philosophical to some extent, which are, is it that contact with other people, especially people from different backgrounds, would create positive effects, like we would promote more tolerance and such, or is it that exposure to others would actually create more isolation and people would become more entrenched in their own groups? I think for the most part, what I've found is that there is some of, like, the capacity to create amenities where people can casually encounter each other. It's not about, I think, just the kinds of places where people purposely go to have fun or do things. It's more about the everyday kind of interaction that matters. And that creates this sort of informal connections with people that then you can relate to in moments of crisis, in moments of need. I think my research mostly aligns with Eric Kleinenberg, who's a sociologist who wrote a couple of books about Chicago and New York recently. And his main hypothesis around this idea of social infrastructure is that once you create these kinds of places, it's not necessarily that people would go because they want to be more tolerant or become more open to others. It's just that it ends up happening through everyday interactions. And then when crises arrive, like let's say a heat wave or whatever other crisis, people can rely on even those who they just met a few times and they see each other on the street.
Right.
I think that's about that.
Right. And does that explain maybe also why you were interested in the pedestrian intersections? Because it sort of also just generally gets at the idea of being able to get out into the street more and interact more.
Yeah, exactly. The whole thing with the pedestrian intersections also comes from how important in the past 20 years, I think, has become this issue of walkability. I think it started in health research, and people who are in the audience may know this better. Public health, urban health scholars, and policymakers started to think more about the effects of having places where people could actually exercise well or have the opportunity to walk to places. And that started as in that realm, and eventually it became more clear that in the past, I don't know, like 80 years or so, cities had been designed with less attention to pedestrians, and that has fostered these kinds of isolation effects in some ways. So I think that's why I also got interested in including measures of pedestrian accessibility, which I think help in that same direction of opening up opportunities for people to encounter.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm going to go to some more audience questions because we're getting a good amount. One person asked, it would be interesting to follow up on the specific locations and amenities or features that contribute to higher levels of trust being observed in those surrounding locations. Do you have any specific examples of neighborhoods and key amenities as pedestrian spaces? You've spoken about the amenities, but you haven't necessarily spoken about the specific locations, specific neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I haven't zoomed in enough, I think, on cases, but through this data. But I do, I've been a TA, and I've also taught as a course instructor a course on the sociology of neighborhoods. And in that course, I got the opportunity to talk to, like, students have a research project that's based on doing research on a single neighborhood throughout the semester. And some of the neighborhoods that students did research on were neighborhoods that had the priority area designation or the neighborhood improvement area designation in Toronto in the past, 10 years or so. And what I found through that was an interesting story about the fact that the good and the bad, right? Like the positive and the negative outcomes of that. And the positive side, for most part, was that community centers had become so central to their lives because they had funds through while the neighborhoods were designated. Having funds meant having after-school programs, having other kinds of events happening on a regular basis. I think community centers and local libraries became more important for these communities, and I think that could have had an important effect on people trusting more in one another, especially within the community, not necessarily outside, but at least within. And the negative side of that was also that a lot of people complained that funds ran out quickly, especially after 4 or 5 years of the program being kick-started. So I think the data, as it is aggregated at such a high level, it's hard to unpack the individual level. I think for a future project, what I'm trying to do is see trends over time, which I think I still cannot do properly with this data. But there are some new ways of doing it. As part of the Urban Genome project that I'm part of, we've been working using Yelp data to see how different amenity compositions have some effects on cities, but I will have to pull some of the trust data and use it there. I haven't done that yet. It's just a challenge to do it empirically at this level of aggregation, but for sure, it's amazing. It's really interesting.
Right, and actually, well, that's fantastic. Because you just got to the next audience question, and they did ask if you had considered the effect over time, but they went on to say that there's interesting research that may connect to what you're doing regarding the relation of community and heritage. So maybe, do you want to speak a little bit more about what do you think that adding the element of time could show you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I think time is such an interesting variable when it comes to urban change, because sometimes the things that change the most are the things that stay the same more. I'll use an example from another project, just as to show what I think may be happening in some cases. When we did with the people at the Urban Genome, we wrote a paper about the changes in the way people talk about neighborhoods using Yelp reviews a couple of years ago. And one of the things that was interesting about the paper was that one of the neighborhoods that changes the most in terms of amenities and businesses and things is the annex. But the way people talk about the annex has remained incredibly stable over time. So people talk about the annex in the same way, despite having different kinds of amenities, or at least at the business level, right? So I think one of the interesting things about trust in this case to see in changes over time would be, one is the effect of specific interventions, planning decisions, increased density, new projects, access to transit. For instance, one of the most interesting things to see in the next few years will be the effect that the Eglinton LRT will have in the communities that will benefit from this new transit line. One of the first times I showed my maps of trust to people, and I think Enid may commented when we were going through the run-through of this presentation, was that the distribution of trust in the city seems to follow the subway lines. And I think that's not casual. I think that has, the more people experience life outside their communities, I think the more likely it is that they become more familiar with others and potentially more tolerant. So over time, that would be a great project to see, like just the effects of changes in the access to transit, which is such a big part of the amenities that I'm trying to unpack here.
Right. Yeah. No, that would be really interesting. Yeah. A couple of more questions for the audience here. So one person asks about, you mentioned Toronto's TSNS program, and asked, do you know if other cities have programs like that?
That's actually a good question, because also it has to do with one of the other projects I'm working on. I think there is some uniqueness to the program, to the Toronto intervention, because of how advertised it was. I think there's a lot of other cities that have had targeted interventions on spatially defined areas and communities. Chicago was pioneer early on in the 50s and 60s. And even Vancouver has had some of these kinds of initiatives in the past. But I think what was interesting about this particular initiative was that first, it was built on recently defined neighborhoods that the city drew over the map of the grid of the city. So it was kind of like you have a new set of neighborhoods, and then some of them get designated. So that was kind of like a parallel process that happened in an interesting time frame. And the other thing was that it became such a big political issue in the David Miller's agenda at the time. And then it was really highly contested by the Ford administration later. So I think there are some initiatives. The UK has had something like that about rebuilding communities, but it was nationwide. The Netherlands have had initiatives like that, also nationwide. So there's a very unique flavor to the Toronto version of this kind of initiative, for better and worse, right? Like it had a lot of like positive outcomes, as I said, and I think the redevelopment it took into like they had in 2013, the relaunching and the 2020 version, I think they've managed to overcome a lot of the challenges that they first encountered, and in part it was, I think, because it was such a unique kind of intervention because of how advertised it was and how many resources were first allocated. The problem was that they dwindled down. But yeah, it's an interesting question because I think finding a comparable case is hard just because of how unique the context was for that.
And I mean, and you know, if you don't know too much about these other programs, then just say so. But I'm interested in the ones you mentioned. There's some other countries that do this more nationwide, and that seems, you know, that seems like a hard thing to do at a nationwide level. But were there benefits that came from doing it at that higher scale, or really is it something that works more locally?
I think the nationwide programs usually ended up handling the decisions to municipal level governments.
Okay.
Actually, there was something similar from the federal level, the early 2000s here as well. So the whole thing about the strong neighborhood strategy has background in also federal decisions to start supporting communities. It was just that Toronto, that's the city, it's like the largest city in the country, had a lot of new resources after the amalgamation, and like it had some unique features because of that. I think some of the interesting things about other programs is that they kind of work in a similar fashion to a template of place-based policies that tend to be basically about tax cuts. So like tax credits, tax benefits, like let's bring jobs to the community and maybe some redevelopment, but there's not a lot of like active intervention in social infrastructure, as it was with the strong neighborhood strategy.
Right.
So I think that's where they're different in some ways.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah. Another question we have here, it's pretty simple, and it'll be interesting to hear the answer. Are there any amenities that negatively affect trust? Did you find anything like that?
I did. I did not I mean, at least with the ones I tested. What I did find in some cases was that I think some of the models, I can go back to it. In some of the models, the effect of some of the built environment measures was actually, if not negative, at least not significant. Which, yeah, but I don't remember seeing any. I'm just going through my results here, but I don't remember seeing any negative effects in the through the proximities. No, it's an interesting question. I think it's more some of what I think would be. There's some research that I've read, not the one that I haven't done that here as much, but some of the stuff that I'm interested in is also the effect that new developments, new projects, especially community housing, affordable housing projects, have on set, like the similar outcomes. You know, like, and previous research has shown that it actually doesn't have a negative effect. In some cases, it has a positive effect on, like, you know, on sentiments of community and such. But it's usually one of the more contested issues. The kinds of amenities, I think, are in the proximity measures database, and the pedestrian-friendly intersections, I think they're not as contested. So probably that explains a bit why there's not a lot of that. But like, I wouldn't be sure that things like having, you know, a prison or of like some kind of like big infrastructure, carceral infrastructure like that would have some, you know, different effects, but not the ones that we're accounting for. No.
Right. No, understood. Yeah. Another audience question we have is asking about the controls that you use. They specifically asked, did you control for population homogeneity, noting that, you know, some amenity intersection-rich neighborhoods may have similar levels of education and income, political and social bonds. So can you speak a little bit more about how you use your controls there?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I think for the whole thing about homogeneity is one of the most interesting things in the literature about trust, because it kind of goes back to a very different the whole, some of the literature on trust comes from Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, social capital literature, and Putnam and others had this very controversial hypothesis that higher levels of diversity in census tracts and neighborhoods was associated with lower levels of social trust. And then there was some research that contradicted this finding, and I sort of built on that. But what I don't include a lot in this, the thing with this level of aggregation is usually kind of hard to grasp the level of heterogeneity that can be found in some of these metropolitan areas. So what I've done is, for the most part, include some of the more used variables to measure like elements like you know, visible minority status, low income level, age, and such. But I hope in a future iteration of this same paper, I'm including probably a measure of it's called local segregation, using the different visible minority categories. Basically, what it measures is how different is that specific census tract compared to the metropolitan area, just to see whether you know, there's like one or two groups that are more represented in that particular neighborhood compared to the rest of the city, and whether, you know, that there is an element of diversity playing here. That's part of the 2.0 version of this. Hopefully, if I can get the data on time. But I'm trying to finish this paper and get it published as soon as possible. So it's still a great question. I really like it because I think it speaks to a very specific, very good point about this literature, and it's worth revisiting it. So yeah, I'm working on it.
There's always more data, right? But you have to get it published.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Well, I have a couple more questions just to the audience. If you have any other questions, please do send them in. We can have time for a couple more if you have them. If I was curious, you know, you talked about those interaction variables. You didn't really go into them too much. Maybe you wanted to explain a little bit more what those were about. I did notice the amenity density and acquaintance as one did seem to have positive correlations. But if you want to just explain a little bit more what you were trying to do there.
Sure, Thomas, thanks. I'll just go and share some of the findings for this. Let's see. Yeah, so the interaction terms, there's two ways to handle them in these models. Usually some people would go and multiply everything by everything. But in my case, I've done that and it doesn't really show any, you know, interesting or relevant effects. So what I've done is included some of the more interesting interaction terms that have to do with the predictors, right? So for instance, amenity density and acquaintances, that means that there is a combined effect of the two. In other words, that a positive coefficient here indicates that the effect that acquaintances have, even though it's not significant, it is positive on trust. is multiplied by having a dense, amenity-dense environment. So in other words, people who live in amenity-dense neighborhoods with more acquaintances would have more trust, kind of thing. Similarly, the same happens with amenity density and membership. So those are what the interaction terms usually suggest. I think one of the more, let me just take a look. I think for me, one of the more interesting models is the last one with the radius of the wallet vignette. The reason why I think this is the most interesting and probably insightful model is because one, it's based on a question that doesn't include the word trust in it. So it's based on kind of like the experiment notion that you're thinking about a situation, what would I actually do? Would I think that the person would return the wallet or not? And second, it's about this whole thing, it's a radius question. So it's not a direct question, it's about the difference, what you responded between the stranger and the neighbor, So here, there, like the intersection and acquaintances, like the interaction term is positive, and the effect of acquaintances and the intersections is really high. So that means, I think one of the most, for me, was one of the more interesting things that this kind of confirms the idea that the more acquaintances you have in more pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods, the combined effect seems to be heightened by that kind of environment. Like the effect of having more people you kind of can remember from the top of your head is multiplied when you happen to live also in a pedestrian oriented kind of community.
Right.
So those are what the interaction terms tell. Some of them are somewhat more complicated to interpret, especially when one coefficient falls to the left and the other falls to the right. But when they're positive, it's easier to just see how these two work, But yeah.
No, that's very interesting. And so I have one last question. As I say, if there's any more audience questions, please send them in now. But otherwise, we'll finish off with this one. I was curious if you want to talk a little bit about, how Canadian cities might compare internationally, or whether do you see similar effects as what you found in your research with Canadian cities in other countries? Have you found anything like that in your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I most of these other research that have tried to assess the built environment on trust and on social capital tend to have similar effects, although in some cases more nuanced. But I haven't really found a research design similar to this, at least not that I've seen so far. What I'm more in right now, one of the things I'm interested in doing is that the third paper of my dissertation has to do with a different context, Lima, Peru, where I'm from. And in that particular city, one of the things that I've noticed is that it would be kind of like the opposite image of this, and it is that mistrust is the one that seems to be more distributed. And I think it's almost as evenly distributed as you can get. So in other words, that's kind of like an opposite scenario where people actually don't trust each other, regardless of whether they live in pedestrian-friendly or pedestrian-non-friendly neighborhoods. So it's kind of like a non-effect situation for the most part, but there seems to be some level of community within smaller groups of people, so family and maybe some immediate neighbors. So what I expect to find in cities where more violence, with like less social cohesion, would be kind of like a flip side of this story, right? Like, whereas it doesn't really matter the environment that much because this like the mistrust is so generalized.
Right.
But I'll have to say that's an empirical question more than a comparative case to this point. But that's a really interesting aspect of this research, that it kind of, if you expand it, you get to see how this plays out in places, for instance, with more racial or social segregation that Canadian cities don't tend to have, at least in those degrees.
Yeah. No, that'd be interesting. We did get one audience question here under the wire, so I'll actually finish off with that one. They asked, did you find any influence of roadway geometry? So they're talking about number of lanes or the width of the lanes, traffic speed and discipline, and perceived pedestrian safety. did you find influence of those on a sense of trust in place?
No, not really. One of the things, it took a lot of computational power just to get the pedestrian intersections, to be honest. Like I was playing around with some code for it, but I have included a measure of network complexity, I think is from the urban design on trust. I haven't really tested it yet. That may be a whole other paper, more in the planning than in the sociology realm. So I have some of the data. Whoever asked the question, we can talk about it, because I would be really interested to see if I can use it for, like, you know, some of the data that I collected for this. But I haven't really done analysis using the street network and things beyond the pedestrian part. And I took the pedestrian just because it's a measure that's been validated multiple times in walkability indexes. So like even walk score uses it, you know, like, and on many others. So it's amenities and pedestrian intersections for the most part. In some cases, they add the width of the sidewalks, but that's a bit too hard to get in some cases. So yeah, but I can definitely see myself expanding this. But for the time being, it's just the easiest, more direct measures.
Right. No, that's great. Well, that's a good way to end it, because, you know, more to come, as you say. So, so Fernando, I just want to thank you. That was a fantastic presentation, and it was really great to discuss it with you. It's just always great to be able to get some data to help us analyze some of these concepts that we think about every day. So really great work. And thank you to everyone in the audience who came, and thank you to everyone who asked the questions. Those were fantastic. I'll end by saying that our event today has been recorded. It's going to be available on the IMFG website soon. So please do share with your colleagues who couldn't attend today's event. Thanks again for coming, and have a great evening.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tomas.